Imagine preparing for the absolute happiest day of your entire life. You are suddenly obliterated by a radioactive space rock just hours before the ceremony. This is exactly the catastrophic reality facing our completely unsuspecting bride. But earlier, we find a highly secure government outpost monitoring the skies. The radar technicians react to an impending extraterrestrial threat with absolute, dignified professionalism. Meanwhile, her aggressively narcissistic fiancé decides to casually alter their honeymoon plans. He swaps a romantic trip to Paris for a local news audition in Fresno. This is a masterclass in speedrunning a divorce before the marriage even legally begins. She then takes a direct hit from a glowing meteorite moving at terminal velocity. This impact looks incredible because the animation required 40 million computing hours to render. They built a massive server farm just to process the complex atmospheric dust clouds. She survives the impact and arrives at the altar glowing like a radioactive novelty toy. This prompts her body to undergo a massive, uncontrollable growth spurt right in the chapel. She completely destroys the structural integrity of the church with her newly acquired giant skull. Unsurprisingly, her fiancé demands to be put down immediately. Proving his romantic loyalty has the structural integrity of a wet paper towel. The military then deploys an entire battalion to subdue one confused bride. They opt for a syringe roughly the size of a municipal water heater. She embraces the earth with the gravitational enthusiasm of a dropped bowling ball. Hours later, she awakens inside a heavily reinforced, aggressively orange containment cell. She casually rips a solid steel door off its hinges like a cheap candy wrapper, revealing a subterranean vault that looks like a brutalist architect's fever dream. She then inspects a spoon large enough to comfortably serve as a dining table, only to be greeted by a deeply unsettling hybrid of a scientist and an insect, which naturally triggers her primal instinct to swat him with a giant cutlery. Before she can finish the job, a sentient blob of blue gelatin introduces itself. This anomaly immediately forgets how to breathe despite lacking a respiratory system entirely. This scene required the animation team to spend 8 grueling months studying gelatin, just to accurately render the precise physics of a translucent blue jiggle. General Munger casually informs Susan that the government has officially rebranded her as Genormica. He leaves her to process this forced identity change in a dimly lit concrete box. Meanwhile, an extraterrestrial megalomaniac discovers his missing space rock is currently on Earth. He immediately dispatches a towering mechanical cyclops to retrieve his property with extreme prejudice. This violently interrupts a deeply awkward teenage romance in a secluded California orchard. This prompts the government to deploy their absolute highest authority figure to the scene. The president approaches the giant hostile entity armed entirely with inherent diplomatic optimism. He initiates first contact by aggressively mashing the keys of a vintage Yamaha synthesizer. This notoriously complex 1980s instrument famously required a mathematics degree to program correctly. The alien machine processes this auditory assault with the cold indifference of a broken ATM. It then politely attempts to flatten the commander-in-chief into a presidential pancake. The military retaliates with missiles that possess the structural impact of toasted marshmallows. This forces the administration to execute a highly choreographed tactical retreat to the war room. There, the general proposes deploying his secret collection of radioactive biological anomalies. He delivers this brilliant strategic pivot while unnecessarily parachuting indoors. Predictably, the military's complete tactical failure leads to the absolute most logical backup plan available, aggressively strangling the commander-in-chief to secure immediate funding for a Black Ops petting zoo, which naturally culminates in deploying our newly acquired radioactive bride alongside a prehistoric fish man, who is currently being subjected to a deeply unethical, makeshift chiropractic adjustment by a bug. Because nothing screams national security quite like blackmailing a group of heavily traumatized science experiments. They are promptly air-dropped into San Francisco to quickly intercept the looming mechanical threat. A cinematic sequence that was notoriously difficult for the animation team to actually pull off. DreamWorks literally had to partner with Intel to build a brand new multi-core processing facility, just to render the complex geometry of the bridge cables and traffic without completely crashing, which makes it incredibly ironic that the monsters immediately get flattened by a giant foot, proving that their combined combat strategy possesses the structural resilience of a damp saltine cracker, leaving Susan to attempt diplomatic negotiations with a heavily armed, Cyclopean Space Toaster, a brilliant tactical gambit that mathematically guarantees she will be sprinting for her absolute life. Truly an inspiring masterclass in intergalactic conflict resolution. Predictably, her cardiovascular terror leads her straight into downtown traffic. She casually straps two mid-sized sedans to her feet. This creates the world's most economically devastating pair of Heelys. She then decides the Golden Gate Bridge is a tactically sound escape route. She completely ignores the fact that it is a bottleneck suspended over freezing water. The animation team actually spent 3 weeks studying the bridge's exact international orange paint. They quickly discovered their rendering software kept outputting the iconic structure as neon pink. This forced the studio to manually color correct every single frame of this structural failure. The Cyclopean space squid finally catches up and begins aggressively dismantling public infrastructure. This forces our protagonist to physically hold up a collapsing steel deck. It is a brilliant strategy to test the absolute limits of her mutated lumbar spine. She eventually defeats the machine by dropping a massive chunk of bridge onto it. This proves that raw gravitational violence is the universal language of diplomacy. Meanwhile, the four-eyed intergalactic middle manager watches his expensive toy get crushed. He reacts with the dignified composure of a toddler denied a juice box. He promptly orders his ship to abduct the woman who just ruined his afternoon. Susan casually introduces her newly acquired biological anomalies to her deeply unprepared suburban neighbors. She hoists her parents into the stratosphere with the gentle touch of an industrial crane. A gelatinous blob then immediately attempts to asphyxiate her mother out of pure affection. She decides the best way to reconnect with her fiancé is a live television kidnapping. He responds with the sheer, unadulterated panic of a man facing a firing squad. He ends things because his fragile ego cannot process a woman taller than a sedan. It is a masterful display of toxic insecurity masquerading as career ambition. She retreats to a gas station roof to process this devastating emotional trauma. This lighting was engineered using a proprietary algorithm specifically designed to render asphalt reflections. This marvel cost the studio $3 million just to make her depression aesthetic. She realizes that fighting an intergalactic death machine was infinitely more fulfilling than local broadcasting. Naturally, the universe rewards this profound personal growth with an aggressive, uninvited tractor beam abduction. The giant grub attempts a rescue, only to be violently swatted by an orbital laser. Our heroine awakens on a cold, metallic floor with absolutely zero tactical advantages. Unsurprisingly, our protagonist wakes up trapped inside a neon-pink cylindrical prison. She is immediately greeted by an extraterrestrial bobblehead riding a floating Segway. He demands her radioactive energy with the polite urgency of a telemarketer. This prompts her to casually shatter the impenetrable force field using sheer brute force. It is a masterful demonstration of advanced alien security architecture failing instantly. She sprints through the ship like a panicked tourist in a subway. She eventually plummets directly into the villain's primary extraction device. This glowing green energy beam actually caused a massive production headache. The animation team had to invent an entirely new volumetric lighting algorithm. They needed it just to calculate the light refractions bouncing off her hair. Meanwhile, the mastermind decides this is the perfect time for a biographical monologue. He casually admits to annihilating his own homeworld because he hated his neighbors. This is a perfectly rational conflict resolution strategy for a highly advanced civilization. He then broadcasts his giant face to the entire human population. He informs Earth of their doom with the casual indifference of a flight attendant. Back on the ground, the remaining mutants initiate a highly questionable rescue mission. The rescue squad executes a flawless infiltration by simply standing on each other's shoulders. This masterclass in espionage completely fools the hyper-advanced alien warlord. They confidently escort their captive away with the casual authority of mall security guards. The doctor prematurely reveals his identity, guaranteeing a mathematically unavoidable firefight. The alien commander suddenly realizes his elite clone army has been compromised. This forces the team to desperately hack the ship's central power core to survive. This highly advanced security system operates entirely on the mechanics of a rhythm arcade game. The animation team actually referenced real competitive dance tournament footage for this specific sequence. This required the rigging department to completely rebuild the cockroach's digital exoskeleton. They did this to prevent his rapidly flailing polygon limbs from clipping through his torso. His failed footwork immediately triggers a catastrophic self-destruct sequence for the entire vessel. This leaves our protagonist conveniently trapped behind a slowly descending, dramatically heavy blast door. She logically decides to intercept the villain's personal escape pod mid-flight. She applies the indisputable laws of gravity to his floating luxury sedan. She reclaims the glowing energy source with a gentle touch of a synchronized swimmer. Susan and her newly rescued squad immediately plummet from the self-destructing alien vessel, showcasing her brilliant tactical decision to enter a terminal velocity freefall without a parachute. Masterful. Fortunately, they are abruptly caught by a freshly metamorphosed giant butterfly, as the Cyclopean dreadnought detonates in the background with the subtlety of a supernova. This fiery spectacle makes perfect sense when you realize the production's technical demands. The animation team had to write a custom fluid dynamics algorithm for this sequence, which ultimately consumed over 300 terabytes of server space just for the pyrotechnics. Back on solid ground, her aggressively mediocre ex-fiend attempts a truly pathetic reconciliation. He tries to leverage her literal planetary defense into a local news syndication deal, proving his emotional intelligence is roughly equivalent to a damp piece of cardboard. Inspiring. She predictably rejects his transparent opportunism by launching him into the upper stratosphere, where he is immediately intercepted and suffocated by a sentient blob of blue gelatin, a fittingly humiliating punishment for a man whose fragile ego requires its own zip code. Suddenly, the military arrives to announce a radioactive snail is currently terrorizing the French, prompting the newly formed strike team to immediately fly off into the sunset. And that concludes today's case study in profound incompetence. If you somehow found this tolerable, feel free to subscribe.